Kwe Nindaluizi Palmater. I'm from the sovereign Mi'kmaq Nation on unceded Mi'kmaqi territory, which is most of the maritime provinces, part of Quebec and actually part of Maine. Our territory is unceded. We have, our treaties are different in the sense that they're all pre-Confederation treaties, and they speak to military alliances, and the kinds of things that we were supposed to get in our treaties were things like guns and ammo. So I'm still waiting for my guns and ammo. But it's a real privilege to be here. I know every time I travel to different Native territory that it's a privilege to actually be in that territory, and it's certainly not a right, and I respect that right. And I really want to thank the Grand Chiefs in the room, the chiefs, the citizens, the conference organizers for inviting me here, even though I'm not from Treaty 5. But I think as treaty people, we all share the same concerns and issues. And I also want to thank the elder for opening and honor the medicines that are in the room, and thank you to the youth who are doing such incredible work. I mean, imagine being 16 years old and already being an international traveler and speaking out about the injustice to Indigenous peoples. It's really shows a strong message about speaking truth to power, and also about the TRC calls to action and how important they are. So I'm going to be talking today about Native sovereignty, and there's a lot of debates around sovereignty, and I kind of want to address some of those things because I really think it's the core of our nationhood. Oh, okay. Is that better? Okay. All right. But I think it's important, as all lawyers always have to say, is nothing can be taken as legal advice. If you need any legal advice, make sure you get your own independent legal advice. So today I'm going to be talking about three things. First is Native sovereignty, and then where we are in terms of Crown relations, because I know there's a wide variety of opinion on where we are, and then also get back to nation building. What is the path going forward? Because I think so often we get stuck in the where we are right now, the contribution agreement we're signing right now, or the economic development proposal that we're working on right now, and it's really hard because of the lack of resources to really focus on where are we headed in terms of our nation building, as opposed to just always being forced by the government to focus on our local crises, you know, be it socioeconomic crises or political crises that they create and we have to respond to. I think it's really important that we keep in mind the nation building aspect and the fundamental nature of sovereignty and the need to protect our sovereignty in everything that we do. And I'll say ahead of time, because whenever I talk about sovereignty, someone inevitably puts up their hand and says, well, there's no word for sovereignty in my language, or you're using the English language, you're relying on English laws and definitions, and you know, we need to have these conversations, and we need to have very open and frank conversations about these things. And what we can do with this push for decolonization is, in fact, you know, kind of block ourselves into a room where we can't talk about anything, and I don't think that's helpful. It's true, I have no choice but to stand up here and speak in the English language because of the impact of residential schools on our languages, and not every generation now is able to speak our languages, and so we have to communicate somehow in another language. And I think we also have to look at our languages in non-English or non-European ways. So there may not be a word technically for the word sovereignty in, say, the Mi'kmaq language, but that's only if you're looking at it in a translation. The very word Mi'kmaq implies nationhood and sovereignty and independence. And so we have to even train ourselves to look at these words and look at these concepts a little differently. And the UN study on treaties said the very same thing, that we can spend all of our time kind of trying to negotiate or debate how to have these conversations, or we can just get into those conversations and forgive each other for the fact that we can't have all these conversations in all of our languages simultaneously at the same time. And the same thing with the terminology that we use today. I know there's political correctness around using the term Aboriginal or the term Indigenous as opposed to the term Indian. But, you know, there's a lot to be said for Indian pride and Native pride. And yes, the word may come from the Indian Act, but with all of the Native people that I work with in Canada and the US, you know, this kind of red power movement and the pride that we have and the fact that it's only our Indian nations on this continent that have been here from time immemorial, and then we're the only ones with true sovereignty. I think that's what matters, as opposed to the word that's being used. Because ultimately, for me, and it'll be different nations in here, the important thing is that it's Mi'kmaq sovereignty, not whichever word the government is using at the day to kind of pan-Aboriginal describe us as all under one big lump. And I think if we're going to have this conversation around sovereignty, those kinds of things need to be said, because what is sovereignty? If we're going to have this conversation, we can't worry about what's the nice thing to do, what's the right thing to do, let's make sure we're inclusive, let's make sure we're diverse, and all of that stuff, because Mi'kmaq sovereignty is about Mi'kmaq sovereignty, and it's about Mi'kmaq territory, and it's about Mi'kmaq nationhood. It's not about what is the politically correct thing to do. Well, let's include all these other people, or let's include other concepts that don't belong to us. And I think when we think first and foremost about what is Native sovereignty, it's first and foremost around land. Any Indigenous concept, and from the research that I have done all across Canada and the US, when you talk to Native nations about what it means to be a nation or a people or a sovereign, they talk about their territory. Well, it starts first and foremost in our territory. And it's the core. And that's why things like comprehensive claims and specific claims from the federal government are so harmful to our status as sovereign nations. Because what Canada is literally doing is trying to buy its sovereignty 1 acre at a time. Now, it's true, you might get some compensation for lands that they used and they shouldn't have used, but you're giving up your sovereignty and your rights in that territory in exchange for something else. And they even have this prohibition. Their preference is to actually compensate with money as opposed to land for land. And when we do that, we're literally allowing them to buy their sovereignty acre for acre, because you have to cede and surrender your right in that piece of land in order to get the compensation, even if you're going to get another piece of land. But none of that is actually legally required. There is nothing about making a just resolution of claims over your land that actually requires that you surrender it. There's nothing wrong with saying, well, we're not surrendering our land, it will be ours forever, but we will allow you to use it. We will give you a permit to keep your power lines up. And that's fundamentally different from just, we surrender, we surrender, we surrender, we surrender, because I don't think anyone in this room would say our treaties surrendered any lands. It certainly wasn't anyone's intentions. But what they're wanting us to do through specific claims and comprehensive claims is do just that. Do what our ancestors refused to do. And so we have to look at, how we hold our land. Because holding your land separately in fee simple is a little different, or in a grant from the government is a little different than holding it as your actual sovereign territory or traditional territory. And that makes us fundamentally different from anyone who comes into these territories afterwards. Whether it's, original settlers or new immigrants or visitors or any other cultural groups. They may buy a piece of land, but that land is always subject to our underlying title. And Canada would have us believe, because it necessarily takes away from our sovereignty, that Aboriginal title only belongs to nations in this land that never signed a treaty. They would have us believe that. But even the United Nations study on treaties that specifically went around the world and looked at European treaties with Indigenous peoples said there was no intention to surrender any lands. Half the time, the European negotiators didn't even tell people that that was the legal effect, and that no court of its worth would ever uphold a land surrender in any of the treaties that have ever been found. So we need to start pushing back on their challenges, pushing back on their positions, especially when we're negotiating. The other thing about sovereignty is that we have always known whose territory is whose. We might not always have agreed. We may have engaged in historical battles to, expand our lands or trade our lands, but we have always defended our territories. The Mi'kmaq knew exactly where Wolastoq territory was. The Mohawk and Haudenosaunee knew exactly where Cree territory was, and so on and so forth. And that's an essential element of sovereignty and nationhood, having a defined boundary that everybody else knows. That doesn't mean that we prevented everyone from being in our territories. Like the Mi'kmaq, for example, we allowed people to come in, but they had to get our approval. If you want to hunt here, you have to have our approval. If you want to live here, you have to have our approval. And that is fundamental. Now today, the government will often throw in your face during negotiations, oh, well, there's overlapping claims. And overlapping claims, for the most part, have been manufactured by federal and provincial governments. Indigenous peoples have always known our territories, but then they will create a map and say, well, look, we can't talk to you because there's all these overlapping claims. By whom? Who set this map? Who set these boundaries? And that's part of the problem in BC. I know you don't have to worry about that here, but they are so-called overlapping claims that the province and government has worked very hard to create, because then they don't have to talk to anyone, and they allow people to fight amongst themselves. And here, I think it's been very clear, just like it is in the Maritimes and most parts of Canada, that our territory has always been known. Our elders could tell you exactly, here's where Cree territory is, or here's where Anishinaabe territory is, and so on. And that's a fundamental element, even in international law, about determining someone's sovereignty. And the other thing about it is that it distinguishes us from people who just randomly claim Native identity today. Right? We're not, or any other kind of cultural identity or any other claim to Canada, we're not a diaspora of people. So we're not just random individuals living anywhere in Canada claiming some kind of identity. We're actually collectives with defined territories. And I think it's fundamentally important that we keep that kind of fundamental process in place, that ideology around our territories being very clearly defined. Because sometimes, and I hear government officials kind of try to throw this in our face all the time during negotiations, they'll say, well, all Native people, they had no concept of ownership. They had no concept of, control or use of land. They were just random nomads wandering around the countryside. So one, that's wrong. And two, that only serves to perpetuate a myth in society that we had no concept of land. We literally wouldn't have been shooting one another to defend our territory if we had no concept of land. Now, our concept might be different. We might not be about raping and pillaging the land. We might be more about responsibility and protecting it and using it for our future generations. But that's still a form of governance and sovereignty over our territory that's very much legal, just as it might be a part of our traditional knowledge. And then the other core part of sovereignty is the people itself. Like I said, we're not random diaspora. We're not just random individuals who come together and form an organization and say, hey, we're the Aboriginal peoples of Canada and we're making all these claims. We're actual nations of collectives, grandmas, grannies, aunts, uncles, kids, multiple generations. And we have lived primarily in defined territories. Now, like any other nation, we can go off of our territory, we can live off of our territory, visit off of our territory, but fundamentally, our nation is always territory-based, and it's about those collectives. And the collective signifies more than just a cultural group. Because here's the other problem in government dialogue and in all of the court cases. They're trying to reduce us to cultural groups. And they're trying to reduce our powers to cultural powers. You know, so you can control your culture, you can control your language, maybe a little bit of hunting and fishing, but when it comes to the core aspects of who we are as sovereign nations, governance and lawmaking and enforcement and trade and intertribal and international relations and economies and science and all of those things that every other nation engages in, they tried to deny us that and say, well, you're just really like any other multicultural group. And we're not. And I think we have to, when we're talking about sovereignty, really focus on the full range of our sovereignty, which is jurisdiction in all of those areas, whether or not any government agrees. Because sovereignty is not about recognition. Recognition follows sovereignty. So if you look at any other country in the world who's asserted sovereignty and they were never recognized by the United Nations or any other countries, and then one day they were, why were they? They weren't sovereign because someone one day said, you know what, I recognize this little country of Kosovo. They are sovereign because they asserted it, they lived it, they defended it, they died for it, they did it over and over and over and over and over again until they were in fact a sovereign country, and then they just got recognized afterwards. It's never the other way around. You will never see a granting commission anywhere in the world that says, I grant you sovereignty, I grant you sovereignty. So we can't chase that. We have to remember we already have all of the fundamental aspects of sovereignty for our nations here in this country. And the other thing about, the really important thing about the collective is that it's really a two-way street. So we have our nations only because our citizens recognize our nation, contribute to our nation, and defend our nation. If we don't put enough time and effort into our citizens, we're not going to have defenders. We're not going to have people that volunteer and give up their time or contribute to nation building. And that's how our nations fall apart. And vice versa. Our citizens have a nation to call their own because our nation keeps that nation together with all of their governing and their laws and their practices in all of the, imperfect ways that we do it because we've been so impacted by colonization, but we're doing it anyway, and we will work out all of those problems later. We have no choice but to focus on protecting our nations and our sovereignty. And I would argue that we do have words, phrases, concepts for this idea of sovereignty and nationhood, freedom and independence, and that we have been asserting it since contact. I mean, I could literally stand up here and give you quote after quote after quote after quote from treaty negotiators, chiefs, leaders who have constantly pushed back since contact to say, no, 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 we're supreme in this territory and this is our land. And here's one of them. During the treaty negotiations in the eastern provinces, which included some of my Mi'kmaq nation, you have the native representative telling the negotiators, stop trying to include land in our treaties. That we're not giving up our land. And they said, this land where you want to become absolute master, this land is mine. I have come out of it like the grass. It's where I born and reside, and it is my land. That is mine. And throughout all of the treaty minutes, which you'll never find in the treaty documents, but all of the treaty minutes, the representatives kept saying, you don't get to step an inch over where you are right now. This is our land. We're not surrendering any of our sovereignty. And they made false promises. Don't worry, none of that's in your treaties. Don't worry, you're not giving up your sovereignty. So we were very, very forceful. And there's lots of examples all across the country. in treaty negotiation minutes and also in the stories from the elders about what really happened during those negotiations. And I think it's a myth for them to perpetuate otherwise. It's a myth for them to perpetuate that anyone in this country in historical times surrendered their lands. Then you have all the way out in BC, where the BC Interior chiefs at that time, way back in the 1800s and 1900s, kept saying, no, we're not negotiating treaties out here. And more than that, you need to remember that even if you live here, even if we let you by agreement live in our territory, we're the ones who are supreme here. We are the supreme sovereigns. And one of the quotes from them was, when they first came among us, there were only Indians here. They found the people of each tribe supreme in their own territory and having tribal boundaries known and recognized by all. They know that, we know that, but they have worked very, very hard to convince our people otherwise and to convince Canadian society otherwise and to develop a legal system which essentially creates a myth, legal fictions around all of this stuff to, after the fact, justify what they have done. Yet our sovereignty remains intact. And we weren't the only ones who knew that. They, in fact, knew that at the time. If you look at the Royal Proclamation of 1763, no rights were granted in this proclamation, but rights were recognized. And in fact, the Royal Proclamation recognized that we were nations of Indians. They never said little communities. They never said little groups of roaming nomads. They knew we were nations, and one of the reasons for the Royal Proclamation was the only way to have secure settlement was to ensure that they dealt nation to nation with the nations of Indians and include protections in there. Now, there's a lot of problems with the Royal Proclamation because it's still under their laws and concepts. But even at that time, before they negotiated all of those numbered treaties, they knew we were nations. And I think that's fundamental, and it's not a part of history that we talk about. The government uses the word community over and over. Your communities, your communities, your communities. Very rarely do you hear nation to nation, unless it's Trudeau talking about his relationship with the AFN, MNC, or ITK. And none of those are nations, just FYI. And here's the other thing. It wasn't just what was going on here in Canada, and it wasn't just the people and the colonial officials here in Canada that recognized we were nations. All of the European countries recognized that Indigenous peoples came from nations. And in fact, this same UN study on treaties said that according to the law of nations that existed at the time, all of these Indian nations were regarded as sovereign. So by their own laws, by their own concepts, by their own mechanisms, European countries entered into treaties with us or agreements with us knowing that we were sovereign and all of the legal implications of what it means to be sovereign, which means they didn't displace our laws, they didn't displace our sovereign governing powers, and they certainly didn't displace our claim to our territories by signing fraudulent treaties. And all of that is still intact today. And I think that's one of the most important things about sovereignty. They knew it, and they know it now, or we wouldn't be engaged in a comprehensive and specific claims negotiation process. You wouldn't have to pay people to surrender their land 1 acre at a time if you truly believed you were sovereign. The other research that's been done internationally is that this European practice of entering into treaties, Canada would have you believe that they created this process, but in fact our nations engaged in intertribal treaties north and south of the border and all over the country long before contact. We had confederacies, we had military alliances, we had people that were designated just to learn different languages so they could negotiate treaties. And even according to international law at the time, only sovereign entities can negotiate and enter into treaties with other sovereign entities. Canada would not enter into a treaty with the, Association of Canadian Rights Activists, because you don't enter into treaties with your citizens. You govern your citizens. But for us, we were sovereign nations, and we still are sovereign nations, or where the word treaty wouldn't even be on the table. And I think that's incredibly important, because the public doesn't see it that way. And sometimes our own people don't see it that way. Our own people don't necessarily always understand that we are sovereign entities, and we don't have to take what they give. In fact, we have survived every former prime minister, every former minister of Indian Affairs, every former provincial premier. So anyone who believes that this is the last and only time to get the last and best deal, that's not the case. We can wait them out. We were here long before them, and we'll be here long after them, because that's why the Creator placed us on these territories. And so we need to push back and remind them. And here's the really special thing about Manitoba, is from the time I was a small child, the people that I looked up to were some of the First Nations and leaders in Manitoba, because to me, Manitoba has always been about the heart of the resistance. They refused to give up. And that's why today you have Manitoba is literally ground zero for every horrific thing they can do to your people, in terms of child welfare, in terms of murdered and missing, in terms of over-incarceration, because Manitoba First Nations refuse to give up, and they always have. And even back when the federal government was trying to push the 1969 White Paper to get rid of the Indian Act and treaties and Indians and reserves, and all of the attention was on the Red Paper from Alberta, which pushed back and said, no, we're not going to give up any of our rights. Well, Manitoba also had Wabung. And what's unique about Wabung that you don't find in a whole lot of other documents across the country from the regions is that Wabung said everything is based on our sovereignty. And that was back in 1970, back when lots of people thought we didn't have sovereignty anymore. Wabung says the Indian tribes of Manitoba are committed to the belief that our rights, Aboriginal or treaty, emanate from our sovereignty as nations of people. And Manitoba has never, ever given up that sovereignty. And that's why you see such harsh treatment from both the federal and provincial governments, because you refuse to do so. But the thing about it is it makes you so much stronger in terms of a legal position, in terms of a negotiating position, because everything stems from your sovereignty as opposed to a right. Because the fundamental difference between what Canada's offering and what Manitoba has always said is Manitoba is about, recognition of powers, because that's what sovereignty is. Canada's offering some rights, and rights are under another sovereign. The right to be consulted, citizens have a right to be consulted. But the power of sovereignty is something outside of their constitution. And I think we just need to shift the negotiating tables more in the direction of recognition of power versus recognition of a set list of rights. Because as sovereigns, we can take care of our own, and Canada has legal obligations to us as sovereign nations versus as citizens with some rights. And the other thing I would say about sovereignty is that no matter what we think about it, how we debate it, how we want to infuse it into everything we do, my best advice would be make it always about your own native laws, your own concepts, your own traditions, your own practices. Never, ever, ever rely on Canada's laws or Canada's recognition offerings as how you will go about strengthening your sovereignty and nationhood. Because everything we are and everything we know and every protection we ever need has always been in our laws, but everything bad that has ever happened has come out of Canada's laws, have come out of European laws. And we know that the very foundation of Crown relations, or so-called nation-to-nation relations with Canada and First Nations, is based entirely on what's in their interest. And it doesn't matter who's in government. It could be NDP, Conservative, Liberal, it could be, whatever the provincial parties are at the time. It's not about politics. We think it's about politics, but it's not. The Crown is the Crown is the Crown. According to their own law, the Crown is indivisible. And they all share a core interest, which is acquiring our lands and resources and governing over our territory. That is 100% inconsistent with our sovereignty as nations. So we have a choice. How do we go about these relations? Do we just believe because we want to believe that we've found yet a new government who's making new promises and everything's going to be okay, knowing that it's not? Or do we say, okay, we need to go on a different path. We need to withdraw from processes that aren't working for us or that don't boost up our sovereignty, or at least protect our sovereignty, and try to negotiate a different relationship with the Crown, inside or outside the Constitution, so long as it doesn't impact our sovereignty. And because this picture is about manifest destiny and how this was, all in the best interests of Europeans acquiring our lands. That's why they worked so hard to scalp us, to starve us, to beat us into submission, even just to sign some of these treaties. And we keep waiting for a just settlement, that maybe it's the next guy, maybe it's the next leader that's going to make everything different. But if we actually look at the politics as a whole, from the time of contact to now, even though there's been different political parties, all they do is trade places. In one era, it's the Liberal Party that's being the bad guys, and then the Conservatives come in and they look like the good guys. All of their policies behind the scenes stay exactly the same. It just changes a little bit on the surface. And then in another era, the Conservatives are the bad guys, and boy, we just had some really bad ones for 10 years. And then the Liberals come in and they're like, oh, those Conservatives were so bad, these Liberals look so great. But all of the policies behind the scenes are the exact same. So I always say, we need to look at Crown relations not in the sense of blind faith or what our natural inclination with all of our traditions and customs is to, we reach out our hands in good faith. We constantly do that. But to blindly trust people that we know are not in it for our best interest doesn't help us moving forward when we're talking about protecting our nationhood and sovereignty. So, do we put our faith in our sovereignty and what's got us here, or do we put it in the benevolence of the Crown? That somehow we believe, because they hire enough of our aunts and our friends and our cousins, that they are going to work in our best interest. Because it's not that bureaucracy that makes all of those big policy decisions. It's the people at the top. And the UN study on treaties said, if we're going to really, really look at this whole Crown relationship, be it through treaties or other agreements or any arrangements that we have with the Crown, we have to do it with our eyes open and to understand that European law is an instrument of colonization. In fact, they created laws after the fact to try to justify all of the things that they were doing on our territories. For example, the doctrine of discovery. Some court in the US says, jeepers, how do I reconcile the fact that, the natives here are sovereign, but then these states and, federal government want to assume sovereignty. Well, let's just make up this law that says the title of native lands goes to anyone who discovers it, as long as it's a European country, which is fundamentally inconsistent with European law on sovereignty and the fact that they recognized us as sovereign nations. So one sovereign can't just assume sovereignty over another territory. But they twist their laws after the fact to try to make it fit. Or the doctrine of terra nullius. Really, they're going to say that nobody lived here? You don't make treaties with sovereign nations if they in fact don't exist. So the problem has never been about our laws or our side of the negotiating table. It's always been about theirs, and they consistently update and change their policies and even their terminology to throw us off at the negotiating tables. And we also have to think about, from the beginning, this was always about their best interest, because Canada and some of the provinces will have no problems going into the media and saying proudly, we are all treaty people, and we have this wonderful treaty relationship. But how hard have they worked to actually educate people on some of the atrocities and massive human rights violations that were committed to force people to sign treaties that they didn't even know what they were signing? So some of the research I did for my master's was actually, what are some of the things that Europeans were noting about treaty negotiations? So to make it completely outside of us, not our elders' stories, but just what were the Europeans saying. And some of the people that were there writing back home to the governors were saying, what Native people are doing here in defending their territories, it's not about ambition or empire like Europeans. It's just to defend their territories. And in fact, all of the injuries that the Europeans have imposed upon Native people have been about divesting them of their land by fraud. First making them drunk, and then making them sign what they knew not what. There is thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of letters and treaty negotiation minutes and everything that will show that the agreements that we made in person, the spirit and intent, the things that we talked about, the things we negotiated, the things we passed tobacco for, the things that we went in ceremony for, are not what they put down on paper. And according to Canadian law, because Canadians hold the pen on what went into the treaties, the courts are supposed to look at those treaties and give us a large and liberal interpretation because of this difference in language. But we haven't seen that. What we've seen is the Canadian courts actually uphold some of the worst parts of the treaty provisions. Some of the other letters said it wasn't just about fraud, but in fact, European inhumanity to treaty negotiators. They would cheat them, abuse them, beat them, sometimes to the loss of limbs, set dogs upon them. And all the while this was happening, while people were being beaten into submission, you have a scenario where one part of the treaty was being written in one sense, in a completely different sense than what was being told to the Native negotiators by the express orders of the governors. So they were specifically told it wasn't a mistake, it wasn't cultural miscommunication, we don't understand what's going on here. It was a matter of, listen, tell the Indians their sovereignty and territory is intact, but write it this way. And that's a fundamental injustice that has not come out in all of this media communications about we are all treaty people. Because I wonder how proud Canadians would be if they knew that their negotiators were trying to beat people into submission. And we all know what impact that has in law. If Louis were to come up here and take a baseball bat and threaten to beat me unless I signed away my property, it would have no standing in law. Yet, even the UN study on treaties that went all around the world said no court of its worth would ever hold up anything that was done without the full and educated consent of the treaty negotiators. And I haven't heard an elder yet say, yeah, we totally agreed to give up all of our land for some lard. I haven't heard one say that. And you certainly can't call this practice of clearing the plains, starving us into submission, as anything other than a legal form of duress. But none of that has been addressed. None of it. And that is fundamental to our sovereignty. One, because you don't enter into treaties with anything other than a sovereign nation. And two, we never gave up our sovereignty. So Canada can't rely on fraud as a measure of giving up our sovereignty. So what they would have treaty people do now, because they know the legal analysis, they know they don't have a leg to stand on. They know that they have to try to bring all the numbered treaties to the table and say, please cede and surrender your rights, and we'll give you something that looks better. What they're not saying is, well, we're asking you because our sovereignty isn't really quite secure over this territory, and if our sovereignty is not secure over this territory, well, then maybe the natural resource transfer agreement where we gave all the resources to the provinces, maybe that's not secure either. And we can choose to use that power in whatever way we want to as sovereign nations, but it really helps to know that we have this power. Because if we don't make our negotiations coming from a position of power, then we get sucked up into what I call the Section 35 tornado. I was going to use a vortex, but the tornado looked more menacing. Because they constantly have us chase their terminology. They'll say, hey, look what we're giving you, and it sounds good, and so then we chase it. It's natural, because these things sound good. Section 35, oh, now we have a duty to consult. So now that they have a duty to consult, what do we ask for? You need to consult with us, you need to consult with us. Instead of, you need to get our consent for everything because this is happening on our sovereign territories and we're the rightful legal governing power. Consultation is something you do with citizens and interest groups. You get consent and permission from the sovereign nations. And those are markedly different conversations, and it's a markedly different way of negotiating at the negotiating tables, either here in Canada or in the US or in any of the other countries. The native nations that come to the negotiating tables all have different negotiating, and the ones that fare better are those that don't use the US negotiating parameters or the Canadian negotiating parameters. It might mean you don't get as much funding at the negotiating table, but funding is nothing compared to our lasting sovereignty. So here's the thing about the Section 35 tornado, because it's not what we had intended. Some of the First Nations that were advocating that Section 35 be put in the Constitution, it was actually to recognize our sovereign jurisdiction and be our own head of power and have self-determination recognized within the Constitution. And that is the one thing that they refused to negotiate. It didn't matter how many times the First Nation negotiators tried to rewrite or amend this concept of First Nation self-determination being in Section 35, it was no all across the board. They were okay to recognize your, Aboriginal and treaty rights, because in their mind, that's hunting and fishing. It's cultural. But when it comes to the core aspects of sovereignty, they said no. And then we went down the rabbit hole of Section 35. So the first court case on Section 35 sounded really good. It was the Sparrow case in 1990. It was about just a core Aboriginal right to fish. And what does that mean? If you have a constitutionally protected right to fish, what does it mean? And the Supreme Court of Canada said it means no other Canadian has a constitutional right to fish. None. That means the Aboriginal right to fish takes priority over everything. Other Canadian fishers, hobby fishers, sports fishers, and commercial fisheries. And they were very specific. They said if a river needs only has 10 fish left, and you need 5 to conserve the fish for the future, and there's only 5 left, but the native people need the 5 to eat, that means no one else in Canada gets any fish. That's a pretty strong priority. While there was problems with that case, it was still a constitutional priority. As the court cases go on, and keep in mind they consider fishing to be more on the cultural end of things, you get to Delgamuukw, and Delgamuukw is about land, and land is attached to sovereignty and nationhood. So everything changes when we're talking about the constitutional protection, the so-called Aboriginal right to land. Delgamuukw said, okay, if you have Aboriginal title and it's protected under Section 35, that has a priority, except for economic and regional fairness, historical reliance, agricultural, forestry, mining, hydro, economic development, species protection, infrastructure development, and the most insulting, settlement of foreign populations. So the settlement of foreign populations can actually trump our Aboriginal title, which is supposedly protected under Section 35. So it only took a short 7 years to have our Aboriginal rights under Section 35 be the highest priority to the absolute lowest. Mining companies don't have a constitutional right to take minerals from the ground. How is it that they get a priority over our Aboriginal title rights? So when Canada's trying to sell you this concept that you don't need the Indian Act anymore, you don't need federal protection for reserves, you'll just be under Section 35 land protection. This is the protection they're offering. And keep in mind, with that protection comes provincial jurisdiction and provincial taxation and federal taxation. Once you're under provincial jurisdiction, where does sovereignty go? Ask any municipality where sovereignty goes. So that's why it's so important to think about our sovereignty and nationhood and our negotiation stances based on our laws and not theirs. Because here's the other thing, even cases that people thought were really good are like Trojan horses. They give you something on the surface, but they take away something fundamental. And in the Vanderpeet case, they said Section 35 exists for one important reason. Native people were here first. But look at their wording. Native people were here first, living in communities. We weren't living in communities. We were living as sovereign nations defending our territories, not communities. And not only were we communities on the land, we were participating in our cultures. Yeah, we were, but we were also trading, manufacturing, engaging in science, treaty relationships, like complex economies. We weren't just engaging in cultures, but you can see why they wrote it that way, because they want to make sure that our protection is like a culture of communities of little cultures, and not anything anywhere resembling sovereign Indigenous nations. And it's this reason, that we were here first and we were celebrating our cultures that distinguishes us from other minority groups in Canadian society. Because what the federal and provincial governments were saying is that, well, if you recognize First Nations, then every cultural group is going to want recognition. And so the Supreme Court of Canada was saying, well, no, they're a little bit different. But if you look at our actual rights, like our right to be consulted, Canadians have the same rights. The right to have reasonable accommodations, Canadians have the same rights. They just package it differently. And if anywhere where that's any more evident is the Trans Mountain Pipeline decision. When the Federal Court of Appeal says, Trudeau, not only did you not consult properly, you didn't accommodate their concerns, you didn't even consider their Aboriginal and treaty rights under Section 35. And Trudeau's response is, well, this is of national importance, it's just going to get built. That was his first response to a court saying, hey, but what about these Section 35 rights? So I don't know that it's the best idea to put all our hope and faith in one section of their constitution to be interpreted by their courts and then interpreted and applied by their governments. That might make us a little on the vulnerable side. And then we have the Haida Nation, because it's one of the cases that talk about sovereignty. So the Supreme Court of Canada does talk about sovereignty quite a bit, but it's always the Crown sovereignty, the Crown sovereignty. And this one says, here's the purpose of treaties. It's actually to reconcile pre-existing Aboriginal sovereignty. So this is one of the first times the Crown recognizes we are sovereign prior to contact. So our pre-existing sovereignty with the Crown's assumed sovereignty. And in law, which do you think is more powerful? Of course it's ours. And then they say that the promise of treaties is that these sovereignty claims are reconciled in an honorable negotiation. I have yet to find a treaty negotiation in this country, of the ones that I've looked at, that have been honorable. And then what about those who don't have treaties? Are they trying to say, without a treaty, the sovereignty claims have not been reconciled and the pre-existing Aboriginal sovereignty exists? I think that's their fear, because that's the whole basis upon which comprehensive and specific land claims and their self-government negotiating process is based on. The fundamental core of all of their negotiations is whatever we decide, you have to cede, surrender, and extinguish. And so, do you see the danger in putting all of your eggs in the Section 35 basket? That's not to say that we shouldn't use Section 35, as a tool to force things that might work for some, not for others. But keep in mind, the government always speaks out of both sides of its face. So you have, and I'm using this government because we're in this government, our Indigenous Minister of Justice, Jody Wilson-Raybould, who made legal arguments in court that we cannot remove gender discrimination from the Indian Act because we are legally required to consult with First Nations first. Even though we've won 4 court cases over 30 years and Canada's been directed to stop discriminating against Indian women once and for all, they're like, oh, we can't, we have to consult first. Literally at the same time, she's arguing in court in the Mikisew case, we don't have to consult First Nations on any legislation impacting their rights because it's our sovereign right to pass whatever legislation we want. Opposite arguments, same day, for 2 purposes. One, why would they argue we have to consult with First Nations before we remove gender discrimination? Oh, because they might have to pay for a few more of our babies. So it's in their interest to use consultation with First Nations as a time delay. But when it comes to passing legislation that might impact the Mikisew Cree's treaty rights, they're like, no, we don't have to consult. And then that court case comes down that says, Canada has the right to not consult with any First Nations on legislation impacting their treaty rights. How devastating. So every time they're sitting at the negotiating tables with you, keep in mind they're making the exact same arguments or promises or directions at the same time. And knowing that helps you negotiate a little bit differently, because their policy agenda has been horrific. I mean, you talk about the 1969 white paper, abolishing the Indian Act, trying to convert reserve lands to fee simple lands, transfer all First Nations to provincial jurisdiction, and no more tax exemptions, no more treaties. And the interesting thing about the white paper is that they developed the white paper after nationwide consultations with chiefs. I mean, they literally must have had some note takers say, we're going to write the exact opposite of everything the chiefs say and develop that as a policy. And people say, okay, well, maybe, that's history, because Alberta fought back with the red paper and said, no, we're never going to provincial jurisdiction. You're not getting rid of the Indian Act, and it'll only be amended with our consent, the pieces that we want amended, because we want the taxation protections, we want the protections for our lands from provincial jurisdiction, and you're never going to eliminate our treaties. Wabung said the same thing, but based it on sovereignty, and said you can't do that to sovereign peoples. You will not abolish the Indian Act, We will amend it how we see fit when we see fit. We are going to retain our tax exemptions, we're going to control all of our own resources, and we are never going under provincial jurisdiction. And I think that's been key across the country. But here's the thing. So Trudeau was so taken aback, by all of the protests and the strong no, that he said, okay, we are not going to do this. We're just abandoning the white paper, let's start over. That's what they tell you. But then when you actually access their historical documents and records, you will see that there was never any intention to abandon the white paper. And in fact, their assistant deputy minister wrote to both the Minister of Indian Affairs and Trudeau and said, here's the plan going forward. We're not changing the white paper. We're just going to break it up into little pieces so it's less recognizable. But we are not changing any of the content. And that's how we're going to go forward working with First Nations. We have to not see government officials as people. Because when you do, you think, well, this is a nice guy, and he has a family, or she's a nice person, and she used to be a doctor, and we get along great, and we go to dinner, and everything's great. When you start seeing them as people, they use that in our cultural traditions and practices, and we don't see them as an entity. You represent the federal government or the provincial government, and we need to negotiate with you accordingly. And no offense, but we are going to fight to the death to protect our lands and treaties and sovereignty. And it's not personal, but we get caught up in the personal. It sounds nice, they are nice. So from the white paper agenda, they just kept moving forward. And then you have the Buffalo jump of the 1980s, and they had a very strategic plan, not just to implement all of the 1969 white paper stuff, but how to do it strategically. How do you get to sell it this time? And their core plan was to actually sell this concept as a joint solution. You get First Nation leaders to stand beside you and do joint announcements. And we see, that's what it is today. But if you can sell it as a joint solution, it's going to be a lot harder to attack. It's a lot harder to say, well, I wonder if that's bad because, this person is supporting it or this person's advocating it. And we trust our people. We will give our people the benefit of the doubt long before we give government the benefit of the doubt. And the other thing they did is they said, well, we need to very purposefully turn the Indian problem back on itself. Let's start blaming First Nations for their own woes. And you can see how in the media, from that time forward, all of a sudden you start hearing media and government officials say, well, all chiefs are crooks. All chiefs are millionaires. If they weren't spending so much money, millions of dollars on all of their mansions, then their people wouldn't be poor. So that helped two things. One, it helped turn First Nations citizens against their leaders, because you can believe that. You believe what's in the media, you believe what's in the paper, and we should be able to believe it. And the other thing it does is it gives support in the broader Canadian public for the federal and provincial governments not to throw more money at the problem, right? Because the problem are Indians and Indians' misuse of money. Yet what they don't say is that there's never been an Indian chief in this country ever that has been paid $1 million in federal funding to be a chief, ever. And that when the AFN did an actual survey of what chiefs and councillors make across the country, their average salary was less than an average Canadian. And the majority made less than municipal librarians. Try to convince any community member of that today. It's almost impossible, even when I show that, because you literally now have decades of the cause of my poverty is my chief. And that's a hard thing to get over when you're doing nation building and negotiations. It creates mistrust. How do you get a mandate to negotiate if everyone assumes that you have $1 million salary? It's to the point where, what was that, Sun News did a whole half-hour video on how I'm a multi-millionaire chief defrauding the people. I've never been a chief, and I wish I was a multi-millionaire. But you don't see any of our chiefs really living in mansions. They may have a house, And maybe some people in our community don't have houses, but you could ask the same question of Trudeau. You live in a free house, Trudeau, paid by taxpayers' money. It's literally a giant mansion, and there's lots of homeless Canadians. Is that the issue, or should we be focusing on how do we provide for everybody? And the government makes sure that we can't. The government makes sure that we're always short, that we can't fund everybody. And that's what this plan was about, because the other thing was to reduce money for two fundamental things: for social programs, so that people would have to move off reserve, and it specifically targeted band operation, I can't remember what it's called, but it's band operational funding. The money you use to provide training for your chief and council, to hire technicians, legal advisors, policy analysts, they targeted that so that our communities wouldn't have any capacity to respond. So as things got worse inside and outside, you had less and less money to even have a policy advisor. Yet when they confront us, I mean, there's a 5,000 person army at Indian Affairs alone. And Justice Canada is the largest law firm in Canada. They can call any of those resources to fight against us. And when do we come to the table? We come to the table, if we're lucky, with one or two people who don't have access to any of those resources. So they did this on purpose. And we're not talking about 1969, we're talking about the 1980s forward. And then, you know, they thought things were going so well, there was so much discord in our communities, that they thought, well, let's try the First Nations Governance Act. Let's try to access all of their own source revenues. Let's get provincial jurisdiction over elections. Let's make the Canadian Human Rights Act apply to First Nations so that First Nations community members can actually sue chiefs and councillors for not having a house instead of always suing the government. And to create more so-called accountable governments where you have to do more and more and more and more reporting, despite the fact that the Auditor General specifically recommended less reporting, because upwards of 60% of all the reports you do are never read by anyone. They're just a make-work project. So what happened? First Nations protested, and the government said, okay, we won't do that. We will abandon the First Nations Governance Act. But they applied the same principle that they did with the white paper. With the white paper policy, they said, we're still going to go ahead with it, we're just going to break it up into pieces. And you'll notice the things that I have underlined there about their core objectives. They got everything they wanted by passing individual pieces of legislation against our will without consulting with us. They continue to get what they want even when they say, okay, we've abandoned it. And this is both conservative and liberal legislation. How do we fight that when at the same time the liberal and conservative policy agenda has been in pretty much sync, that they keep the funding low for social services? They had this 2% cap, funding caps, that any self-government negotiations would be stalled, extended, and only municipal powers offered on the table. Why would you stall and extend a self-government negotiation? Why would you make it last 25 years? Because you can literally take all of the fish and the timber and the minerals out of that territory before you sign the agreement and leave it empty. And that's why they were doing it. You've got the specific claims in comprehensive claims, you've got cede, surrender, and extinguish, and even though they've promised they're not using that language anymore, talk to any of the negotiators at the negotiating tables. They are still using that language, or they're using language that says, you voluntarily give up all your rights, and if that doesn't work, you cede, surrender, and extinguish. It's fundamentally the same thing. They've increased litigation on Aboriginal and treaty rights, and any time where an issue gets a lot of media attention, and there's a lot of pressure on them to once and for all deal with these issues, they defer it. They'll say, okay, here AFN, why don't you go set up a fiscal relations table? And you can work on that for, let's say, the low price of $20 million for the next 3 years. But meanwhile, the First Nations on the ground will not get increases to their contribution agreements. And they do that on every single issue. You can literally see when you study the media, here's the height of the media problem. Oh, it's going to a study, or it's going to a commission, or it's going to a table. Tables are really popular because it's money going around, but no real hardcore solutions from the federal government. The other thing that's probably impacted you here in Manitoba is that they instituted this major delay in additions to reserves, both in the TLE process, but also for First Nations like ours that don't have TLE, we just do regular additions to reserves. It went from maybe a couple of years to add lands to reserves, to 3 years, to 5 years, to 7 years, to 10 years, to 13 years, for no good reason. Even in our territory, when we had all the third-party interests, all the surveys done, what's the reason? Well, someone's on vacation. Well, the file's been passed to someone else. Well, I'll set up a meeting for you with the deputy minister. Meanwhile, our resources are being taken. So now I think it's pretty rich to say, you know, trust me. Everything's going to be different, and how do you know? I give you my word. Oh my gosh. Do they think we haven't gone through the treaty process? That is actually insulting to me, to say, I give you my word, because you can't take any of that to the bank. Because while they give you their political promises, in court they argue that political commitments and election promises are not legal and binding. They don't tell us that. They just hope that we will rely on their word. And what have we gotten? Well, Trudeau's agenda has been developed in complete isolation from us. So instead of not being a top-down process, we do have some tearful apologies. They changed the name from Aboriginal Affairs to Indigenous Affairs. I don't know who asked for that. They didn't just create 2 Ministers of Indian Affairs. Now we have 3 Ministers of Indian Affairs. The third one just kind of slid in under the radar and no one told us. They developed 10 principles, all on their own at Justice Canada, that said, here's how our relationship is going to be going forward. No input from us. And then we have this legislative framework. You know, it was hard enough to argue, let's get rid of Indian Affairs. But to have 3 Ministers of Indian Affairs is really quite disconcerting. Who the heck do we talk to? And it's something that we didn't ask for, yet it costs money, it costs time, it takes resources, and more employees to do that. I wonder what the total count is now of federal government employees, when we've been saying all along, and especially here in Manitoba, chiefs have been saying, you know what, we don't need Indian Affairs. You just transfer us the money and we will govern ourselves. And all of the people at Indian Affairs are like, uh-oh, we better triple up. You know, we're in trouble, we better triple up. So A, it's kind of a bad sign that we've got 3 of them to deal with now. But if you look at it on the other hand, you know, they must be pretty scared if they need 3 Ministers of Indian Affairs. Because you know what, we've dealt with all of them. We can deal with these ones. But oh my goodness. Okay, and then we have these 10 principles. And the thing that really stands out about these 10 principles is that they're all based on Section 35 court cases. So they're nothing new. In fact, they give you less than what you get out of the Supreme Court of Canada decisions. And they sound good, but in fact they're not good. And I'm just going to use one example. So they'll say, you know, the purpose of these 10 principles is Section 35 reconciliation. And we naturally assume, well, reconciliation's a good thing. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission said it's about, you know, making amends for the past and fixing injustices and all of those things. That sounds good. But that's not the reconciliation they're talking about. The reconciliation they're talking about is the reconciliation of Canada's assumed sovereignty with our pre-existing sovereignty, and then they get to decide what happens going forward. That's not what we want. But they're telling us, in writing, here's how we're going to move going forward, and unless we say otherwise, then that's how it's going to be. The other thing is that they're using very tricky Justice Canada words. So they're saying, listen, you don't have anything to worry about, we're not going to limit your Aboriginal and treaty rights, and we aim going to include free, prior, and informed consent? Well, in law, there's a fundamental difference between you have the right to free, prior, and informed consent versus, well, we will give our best efforts to let you have free, prior, and informed consent. And this is the kind of DOJ language that they're using all the way through. The other two important things to get out of that is that their intention about continuing to develop our lands and extract resources from our lands is right in there, that reconciliation requires a new fiscal relationship. But what is the new fiscal relationship in their terms? Is it more treaty money that they should be giving us? No, it's about joint resource development, which means you don't have a right to say no, and if you want money, that's where it has to come from. If that's the case, we're in trouble with these 10 principles. And those 10 principles also follow through into the nation-to-nation framework. They're talking about, we're going to include in this framework only constitutionally protected rights. And for anyone who knows the court cases, so far we're talking basically hunting and fishing. The majority of our rights and our powers are outside of Section 35. They promise to meet the objectives of UNDRIP, but not implement UNDRIP. And every time they say we fully support UNDRIP in accordance with Canada's Constitution, that's the biggest condition you could put on UNDRIP. Basically saying, yeah, we support the idea of it, but Section 35 rules. And Section 35 is the reason why we needed UNDRIP, because our rights aren't being recognized. So you can see the vicious circle. And in case you want to know, what is the government's negotiating tactic? What is their legal advice at these tables? Well, we know Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould has made it very clear that UNDRIP is unworkable in the law. You should really just be focused on the Indian Act. Why don't you put all your energy into getting rid of the Indian Act? Because that actually helps their process. Free, prior, and informed consent. She has said categorically, consent is not a veto. So there is no consent. We get to consult with you. And then on the framework, because we've been very concerned, in this legislative framework, are you talking about recognizing our jurisdiction, or are you making our jurisdiction subservient to federal and provincial governments? And she responded, well, we're drawing down jurisdiction to give to First Nations from federal and provincial governments. We need to listen very carefully when they speak, because they promised that this framework will not impose municipal governments on us. But Trudeau, outside of Canada, speaking to all of the world leaders, said, here's how we envision First Nation governments. After the federal government and the provincial government, and after municipalities, First Nations are the fourth level of government. Municipalities don't even have any inherent constitutional powers. They stem from the province. So how could we possibly be any lower than the municipalities? But Minister Bennett has traveled the country and said very specifically, we have no interest or desire in turning proud First Nations into municipalities. I have no beef with her as a person, but let's fact check. In the legislative framework proposal that she shared with the chiefs, she said Canada gets to choose which nations and collectives it will recognize, as if Canada has the power, and who they'll recognize as natural persons. So some of the chiefs were asking, what the heck is a natural person? What are you talking about? So people made access to information requests. Jeremy Schmidt and some other people said, well, let's ask them, what is your plan? And the Indian Affairs internal document said exactly what we thought they were doing, is that their goal is to treat us like municipalities, because some municipalities they've transferred into what's called a natural person or a corporation in law, and as corporations, they flow funds and enter contracts. They want to do the exact same thing to us, that reserve lands will, quote, be treated as municipal units of corporate persons. I don't know how any more direct we need to get about that, but we need to stop believing the things they say and just look at what their actual plan is. And their plan is that. So because of that, Over the last year, the chiefs have passed numerous resolutions saying we don't want your framework process. And what was Bennett's response? Well, we won't halt the process, but we'll listen to your concerns. That doesn't sound like a nation-to-nation relationship to me, especially when we're not at the ones in control. So what I did is I did a chart of all of the major policy initiatives. Here's what's been offered to us in the last few decades: the White Paper, the Buffalo Jump, Harper's agenda, and Trudeau's agenda. And if you strip away all of the rhetoric and look at the fundamental objectives of all of their policy, it is identical. They want to convert reserve lands to fee simple. And even under Trudeau government, they have been giving millions and millions of dollars to First Nation organizations to find a way to implement reserve privatization. They haven't advertised that. We got that through access to information. They want to transfer jurisdiction to the provinces or have any limited powers we have under provincial jurisdiction. They want to gradually terminate our treaty rights. And they keep updating their language. So back in the White Paper days, I guess they thought it was okay to say we want to assimilate you all into the Canadian population. And then during the Buffalo Jump, the focus was assimilation. So under Harper, he said, well, let's just change the word to, we want to integrate you into the Canadian population, because maybe that doesn't sound like assimilation and we won't know the difference. Trudeau now calls it social inclusion. Fundamentally, assimilation is assimilation is assimilation, and don't let them put fancy words around it. The other thing is that our treaty rights are at risk. And we should be very, very cautious of that, because this chart of what's being offered doesn't look anything like what's in the UNDRIP minimum standards. Minimum standards. So remember when UNDRIP came out, UNDRIP is not new recognition. UNDRIP actually incorporates all of the existing international laws that relate to Indigenous peoples. So this isn't new. You could not have UNDRIP and you could find all of these rights in other entities. And in fact, in UNDRIP, it also specifically includes all of the other international declarations. But the minimum standard of human rights for Indigenous peoples is self-determination, autonomy, to have our lands and resources back, free, prior, and informed consent, recognition and enforcement of our treaties. That's the exact same thing we have been talking about for decades. But none of that is what's being offered. The only thing that's being offered now is to possibly meet the objectives of UNDRIP subject to Section 35. And if we're relying on Section 35, we don't get any of these things. So what's the path forward? Oftentimes people misquote RCAP. RCAP says, it did say in fact, that one of the paths to recognizing our self-determination and our sovereignty and jurisdiction is to negotiate self-government agreements with federal and provincial governments. That was one path. It's the only path that Canada ever quotes. But RCAP said, in situations where a fair and just agreement is not possible or not practical, then exercising our self-determination has to occur outside of that negotiating process, outside of their constitutions and laws, and rely on our inherent sovereignty and laws to exercise and govern independently outside of their laws. It might be practically easier to negotiate, but it also says you don't have to settle for anything just to get an agreement. Your sovereignty is going to stay intact. And that's why, in terms of moving forward, the path moving forward, I focus back on sovereignty, because I don't think we talk about it enough. Is everything you're doing, everything you're negotiating, everything you're signing, protecting or impinging on our sovereignty? And that's a question we should ask ourselves every time. And that moving forward, we need to think sovereignty is at the core of who we are. Nationhood and our collective of peoples, not individuals, but our nation and the viability of our futures depends on our collectives. Land has to be absolutely fundamental going forward. The fact that Canada will negotiate so-called landless bans only helps Canada. It does not help First Nations because they know that land is critical to our sovereignty. Even under international law, the kinds of things they recognize for sovereign nations are a population, land, a government, and the ability to enter into agreements with other states. We have all of those things and more. But if land is off the table, if all they're offering is legislation for languages, legislation for recognition, legislation, like just a legislative offering that does nothing for our land. I want to see them come to the table and say, here's treaty implementation, here's land and resources, and we'll recognize you in whatever way that you want. Because remember, Native sovereignty and jurisdiction is about all of it. Not just our cultures, but all of it. It's governance, it's the economy, it's all of our social systems. It's things like international trade, national security, public safety, emergency management. All of those things that we are not engaged anywhere on the national level. It was pretty hard to find someone to work with on all of these international trade agreements and trying to protect our rights, because they purposely keep us out. And when we're talking about sovereignty, we're also talking about jurisdiction. They would like our jurisdiction to be limited to our reserve lands and just ban members that live on reserve. But as sovereign nations, we decide what our sovereignty is. On and off reserve, on and off territory, band members and descendants, citizens from other nations, anyone engaging in activity in our territory should be under our sovereign jurisdiction in some way. Because here's the thing about Native sovereignty. It's about power, not rights. And they are trying to keep us very rights-focused. They're even called rights recognition, rights framework tables, rights negotiation. They're not talking about heads of power, sovereign jurisdiction. And the other thing about sovereignty is recognition follows sovereignty, not the other way around. We'll spin our wheels if we ask and ask and ask someone, please recognize the sovereign. That's not how it works. It has to be constantly asserted, lived, and defended every day. Asserted, lived, and defended. Our ancestors knew that. They paid with their lives to protect our sovereignty. And for some people who say, Pam, that's not very practical. You know, practically speaking, who can really do that with such small populations? So I'm going to leave you with this parting note on nationhood. Let's look at some examples from around the world. The Vatican is a nation of 800 people. It has a half a kilometer square of land and is completely enclosed within Italy, but it has sovereign nationhood status. Nauru only has 10,000 people, 21 kilometers squared. San Marino, completely bounded within Italy. Monaco is completely bounded on three sides with France, only 36,000 people. And then look at the last two examples I use. If you take Six Nations, they have more than 25,000 band members. They have almost 4,000 square miles, completely outdoes any of those other sovereign nations, and they're within Canada. Who's to say we can't be sovereign, completely independent nations if that's what we wanted? And I'm not saying that that's what everybody wants. It may be practically better to do something else. But for people to say you have to settle for this because the other is never possible means we come in our negotiating position halfway down instead of with the full spectrum of possibilities. And it's the same with the Mi'kmaq Nation. So I will leave you with this, that in terms of negotiations, we should be talking about powers and jurisdiction. It's your choice whether it's inside or outside the Constitution, but both are possible. It can't happen without massive federal, provincial, and territorial legislative amendments. There is no possible way that one piece of federal legislation will address natural resources in the province of Manitoba, because the constitutional division of powers does not work that way. And do you think for a second the province of Manitoba is just going to say, yes, we agree with the feds? No. Something much different is required. And when I'm talking about a sharing of natural resources, I am not talking about trees and fish and all of the other things that have been horribly abused by settler governments. I'm talking about they need to share with us taxes, fees, fines, licenses, royalties, and all of the wealth that is generated on every single road and highway, bridge, and ship that comes to and from our territories. Because ultimately, that's only possible because of our lands. We would be 100% independent if we had a small fraction of that. My best advice, don't negotiate in any process that limits or defines your rights, especially your treaty rights. Those treaty rights exist all on their own outside of the Constitution, and you don't want anything that limits them. And I would never agree to a one-size-fits-all. This whole pan-Aboriginal legislation that puts Inuit people and Métis people in with First Nation rights, it changes the whole dynamic. Because Métis people don't have the same rights that First Nations do. That's just a fundamental legal fact. So why would you put all of those things in together and try to make them all the same? If you oppose anything that the federal provincial governments do, don't just tell them in a meeting. Don't tell them on the phone. Don't send them a text. Actually put it in writing. You can agree to sit down and negotiate, but consistently have your positions in writing because the federal government relies on that in court every single time. Well, no one told us. And you can say, well, yes, we told you in a meeting. Where's the record? And they change the record. Negotiate directly with Canada. Never use a third party, especially something like the AFN or the MNC or the ITK that don't have any rights. Only sovereign nations should be negotiating on behalf of themselves, and any prerequisite to any talks on anything should be an influx of resources so you can be engaging with your people all the way along. Everything you know about what's going on, your people should know what's going on. There should be ongoing community information sessions, discussions, active participation for everything. And probably because I went over my time, if you have any questions, there's all my social media sites. I have a much longer explanation of the current federal process on YouTube. You can contact me there or through Louis. I've emailed Louis a copy of this presentation, so if you're all registered by email, I'm sure he can send that out to everybody. And if not, well, just let me know and I can send you a copy myself. So thank you for listening.